Thanks, Mark. Appreciate that overview of all the stuff you're doing in Pennsylvania and the Fleet Challenge. I think for a lot of people, the Fleet Challenge may be a fairly new topic. It's something we've been kind of playing with and working on for a while, so it's good to kind of get that out there, let people start thinking about that. You made an interesting point towards the end. We're all working on V to I deployment, and ultimately the SPAT challenge is really just about the I, but ultimately we need some Vs, and so that's kind of the next step. That makes some sense. So I would like to talk a little bit about some of our OBU deployments in Utah. Again, the SPAT challenge is really just about our issues on the roadside broadcasting SPAT and MAP. But as we start looking beyond the SPAT challenge, start looking at things like the Connected Fleet Challenge, we want to start understanding how we connect vehicles into this system, because that's where we need to ultimately be. So I want to just talk about that a little bit today and some of the work we've done here, and then in future webinars we'll talk some more about that. Just an overview. I'm not going to spend any time talking about our physical deployment here, but just as a reminder for those of you who were on the last webinar or have seen presentations from me elsewhere, our first deployment was an 11-mile state-owned arterial in Salt Lake City called Redwood Road. This 11-mile section has about 30 intersections on it, and we put DSRC devices on 24 of those, actually from 4 different DSRC manufacturers. The application we decided to run on this corridor, and the original corridor, the idea was, hey, we need to learn how to do this. We need to learn how to hang these and make them work. And while we're at it, let's see if we can put an application on. And so we worked with the MITS software, which was written by the University of Arizona for the Connected Vehicle Pooled Fund study, and modified it pretty significantly to work with our bus system. The idea here was to connect some buses from our transit agency, the Utah Transit Authority, or UTA, and allow them to request priority at the intersections when they're late. And the late criteria is 5 minutes. So when they're 5 minutes behind published schedule at certain key time points along the corridor, they are then subsequently allowed to ask for priority at those intersections. And the signal controller will decide whether it can grant priority or not. A little extra, a little early green time, a little late green time. And our goal was to increase schedule reliability of those buses from their state at the time we started this project, about 86% reliable, to about 94% reliable. And early indications have shown that we're doing that. We've been operating this since November, and we're getting that kind of benefit out of schedule reliability. We currently only have 4 buses running on the corridor that are equipped, and we're just getting ready to equip maybe 6 or 8 more buses here as soon as we can get schedules lined up. So that's sort of the background on the deployment itself. Onboard installation is different for every vehicle, and Mark Kopko talked about that. Every different vehicle has a little different system, and so it gives us sort of a new challenge. Every vehicle's a little bit different. One of the key elements of that is the power system. Most of these onboard units are 12-volt DC systems. Some vendors have an ignition and a power line, some don't, and you may need some other DC to DC system if the vehicle you're putting this on isn't a 12-volt system. Or if you have other devices that require other voltage. We, as I'll talk about in a minute, used a Linux coprocessor board, a single board computer to run all of our software, and it's a 5-volt DC system. And so you've got to deal with those kinds of things as you look at at power. Now, today I failed to recognize this. I also have Johnny Turner with me. Johnny is with the Narwhal Group. He's our consultant that has worked on this project with us since the beginning, and we're going to sort of tag team this. And so I'll present some of the information, and Johnny will occasionally jump in. And I think right now he's going to jump in and clarify some things on the power system.
Yeah, I just wanted to add in here that the power systems, and especially fleet vehicles like buses that are more complex and have equipment and systems running on them are a little bit more elaborate than just a vehicle that turns off, and they have shutdown periods and have equipment that has to be gracefully shut down. So as you do installations on these types of fleets, to be sure to be aware of those kinds of things. And if your OBE equipment needs to have graceful shutdown periods, or your applications need graceful shutdowns, those kinds of things, the coordination with those fleet managers or owners is definitely a key to making sure that you have reliability in your system once it's in an operational state.
So here's a couple of early typical photos of installation on one of these UTA buses. There's one of the buses there. They're fairly late model buses manufactured in about 2012. We have an onboard unit. Well, first of all, you notice that there's an electronics cabinet. It's mounted behind the driver, and that's where all of their radio systems, computer systems, and everything else that they have on board the bus is housed. And so the transit agency allowed us to go into that cabinet and take up a little real estate in the cabinet. You can see in the center photograph there, they've got slide-out drawers, and we were able to put our equipment on there. In this particular photograph, there's the blue device is the CODA DSRC onboard unit. Next to that, in that kind of funny-shaped white case, is our BeagleBoard onboard Linux processor. And then there's a power supply unit. And then I'll talk about antenna a little bit later, but antenna we wired from this cabinet up into the enclosure above the driver's head. You can see on the photograph of the bus on the far left side, there's a little bulging fiberglass piece on the front of the bus. Not exactly sure why it's there, but our antenna is inside of that rather than being penetrated out on the outside of the bus. So the onboard equipment is secured to this equipment drawer, and Johnny will talk a little bit about the equipment. This is a picture of a later installation. You'll see in this case the onboard unit is a Lear onboard unit, and Johnny will talk a little bit about some of the issues here.
So there's a lot of equipment, as you see there, and they have a full-blown mobile data computer that's operating in there, as well as the rest of their entire network. And so you need to be careful as you're, well, one, you have to kind of beg for space in this environment, and UTA was gracious enough to give us the adequate space that we needed. We have to have our onboard processor not only for running our applications, but also to obtain interfaces to the outside world, so to speak. So in this cabinet, we're obtaining data from the mobile data computer that's owned by the transit authority, and using that data as part of our application and how our system runs. So a lot of coordination needs to occur there, but basically the buses have a lot of routing and path to get your antennas and power and things installed in a very nice and pretty way, but it's key to coordinate with the transit authority or the fleet owner to make sure that everything goes in here and that you have reliable power systems, and again that you are tying to the right power systems as you do that. We also installed a bracket that covers up the power button on our OBU so that as people opened and closed these cabinets, as you can see, they roll out. They didn't inadvertently shut the power off to the unit, and that we made sure we had sufficient cabling and it was managed so that as the drawers were pulled in and out, there was not any damage to coax cables for the DSRC or other network and power infrastructure in there, because these buses are, as you can imagine, quite an expensive asset that they have. So and there's a lot of money sitting inside this cabinet, so it's just key to make sure everything's nice and neat and operational.
So here's another photo of those devices placed on the shelf in the bus cabinet. As Johnny indicated, There's a mobile data computer system in the bus. Since we're giving priority to the buses only when they're late, we need to know when they're late. And so one of the reasons we connect to the mobile data computer system on the UTA network is to query it about whether the bus is late or not. And so we needed to connect to that. The bus has its own dedicated network, and we had to work pretty closely with the IT staff of the transit agency in order to figure out what that data looked like and how to get at it, and then modify our software to query it appropriately and use the data. So there were a lot of interactions going on based on those kinds of things. Clearly, depending on the kind of application you're trying to run and the kind of vehicle you're tying to and who owns it and what you're doing, those are unique nuances that you have to figure out for each type of installation. And we spent a fair amount of time sort of sorting through that. And the transit agency was very flexible and helpful. There's just some details we had to work through. Another thing about the installation that maybe is obvious if you think about it, but these buses run all day. And we needed to be able to get on these buses for a period of time to install this equipment. Well, that happened in the middle of the night because that's when the buses were in the shop getting cleaned and whatever else and not in service. So rather than take the buses out of service, Johnny's team had to coordinate with the transit authority to be able to get in their shops at night to put in the equipment. So some of those kinds of things need to be thought through. As I mentioned earlier, the antennas are installed up in the fiberglass housing. We were first a little concerned about whether the antenna would get reception up there, not exposed to the atmosphere, if you will, and we have not had problem with that. The signal penetrates the fiberglass pretty well. Johnny's going to talk about a couple of other issues with the antennas here relative to placement.
Yeah, so as was mentioned by Mark, you need to have some sort of RF theory in mind as you deploy not only the roadside but the onboard units. And a lot of the antennas require ground planes in order for the waves to propagate correctly, because as these are omnidirectional antennas, they don't have as much gain in a single direction as a directional antenna does, and so it's important to get as much out of your onboard antenna as you possibly can. And so it's really important to note whether your antenna requires a ground plane or not. So we'll see in a later slide on a different bus where it will mount to an enclosure that will serve as a ground plane. But that's definitely a consideration that must be made, and you will have really diminished range if your antenna requires a ground plane and you don't have one. Some of the DSRC units require two antennas per radio instead of one to provide diversity. We've talked with some vendors, and they indicate that you only need, the OBUs that only require two antennas, you can leave the other leads available for future deployment. There's no need to, cut them off or get a different antenna if your DSRC unit only requires two antennas instead of four. So we actually have that situation where we have different OBUs that require different antenna amounts, and we just leave the others in the event that a different OBU is going to be placed. And it doesn't require that the antenna is shorted or anything special. It doesn't adversely affect the operation of the radio. So it's kind of a rule of thumb for us. We're approaching installing 4 lead antennas for our OBUs so that we're kind of future-proofing what we've got.
So there's another subtlety involved in what Johnny just talked about. Some onboard units have actually 2 DSRC units in them. That's why you'd have 4 antennas, and some only have 2. So depending on the kind of application you're running, you need to think through whether you need an OBU with 2 DSRC radios or 1. And we've purchased both sort of inadvertently. Our MITS application really prefers to have the 2 radios, and so that's generally what we've bought. So that's sort of the installation on these regular transit buses. I want to clarify one thing about how we're operating here and make sure that people understand sort of an apples and oranges question. The primary message you're sending from a vehicle is the basic safety message. Basic safety message is defined by SAE in the J2735 specification, and that's what all of our vehicles will need to be broadcasting. In addition to that, based on our application, we're broadcasting a signal request message to get signal priority. But the BSM, as its title is the basic message that needs to be sent. The BSM has a Part 1 and a Part 2, and it has mandatory elements and optional elements, and there's a lot of detail in there. But we are not connecting to the CAN unit in the physical bus, if you will. And so there are things that you would normally get out of the vehicle itself and broadcast if you were connected into the vehicle CAN, and we're not doing that. So here on the display, here on this slide is in kind of the black and purplish blue are the basic required elements of the Part 1 of the basic safety message. And you'll notice at the bottom things like braking status, vehicle size, turning angle of the steering wheel. We don't know any of that because we're not tied into the CAN of the bus itself. The items in the red boxes are things that we are getting and broadcasting, and all of these are available either through the GPS system or some other way that we've obtained them. So in the lowest red box, speed and heading, that comes out of the GPS system. Latitude, longitude, elevation comes out of the GPS system, and the GPS is part of the onboard unit. There's a timestamp, and the D second or the sec mark near the top there is essentially the timestamp, and it's not quite that simple, but that's what it is. And then there's a message count, which is just a sequential numbering system. But you'll notice in here an ID. It's a vehicle ID, and under normal circumstances, that temporary vehicle ID is random, and it's intended that way so that the vehicle can't be tracked. If you're putting an OBU on a regular passenger vehicle, and it's broadcasting the safety message with location and speed and heading and all of those kinds of things, intentionally the automakers don't want that vehicle to be identified. There's no VIN, there's no make and model or color or plate or any of that. So they assign it a temporary ID because you need some kind of an ID for using the data. In our particular case, we've got these buses, and they're fixed buses, and we're comparing our data to data in the transit system to understand if we're improving their schedule reliability. We needed to know exactly which bus it is. And so we've gone in and modified the BSM message so that the bus number, and you can't read the number, but I've got a little box on the picture of the bus there. There's a little 4 or 5 digit number that defines the number of that bus. And we needed that. So we've gone into the software and replaced the ID, the temporary ID, with a fixed bus number. So that's a lot of description about something that may not be terribly important, but as we look at equipping vehicles, and particularly if you look at the fleet challenge, we're actually not totally connected to the vehicle because we're not broadcasting some of those basic elements, and don't yet have any experience to share about how you would get that information off of the bus. Other people would, but that's just not someplace we are yet. So we've moved on to another corridor now, and we're now implementing this software system on a second corridor. This is different in that it's a brand new bus rapid transit line in Provo-Orem, which is about 40 miles south of Salt Lake City. And for about 50% of its route, this bus rapid transit line is in dedicated lane, and the other part it's not. This system has 47 intersections and 25 buses. They run these buses pretty close together. And we're in the middle of installing this system now. They had a soft opening this week, actually yesterday, so when I show an August 18th completion here, that's when the buses started running. But unfortunately, the physical infrastructure isn't finished yet, the bus stops and some of the lanes and things, and so our TSP system is not yet operational, and we're in the middle of getting it to be that way. But in this case, will outfit all 25 of these articulated buses. In fact, the equipment has already been installed on the buses and the intersections, and they will run down the corridor and, again, request priority when the buses are late. There aren't a lot of things that are different about this installation than the one we just described on Redwood Road with traditional buses, but the antenna placement is a little different because there's the roof of the bus is different. And so Johnny's going to spend just a second talking about the installation of the antenna on the roof. And here you've got a couple of shots of photos of the roof and what it looks like.
Johnny, we do not hear you if you're talking. I think there's a problem with his audio. I'm gonna resolve that in a second.
I'm wondering if Johnny has lost connection. Can you hear Johnny now? Hang on just a second.
Sorry, so as I mentioned earlier, the cabinets on the top of this bus are custom developed for antennas, and you can see that there's different boxes for antennas. The bus has a GPS and also cell antennas and different things up there, and they left a space. That second one in, you can see, is for the placement of the DSRC antenna. This was before it went in, and this will support a ground plane very well because of those metal enclosures. So I just wanted to point that out and mention that that's how we'd go about doing that.
So the third project we're working on, we're equipping vehicles, is a little different. We've decided that as long as we had RSUs installed on a corridor, we would start looking at other uses for that equipment. And we've decided to outfit some snowplows, and we've picked additional corridors for a snowplow preemption system. The concept here is that the plow would actually be able to preempt the signal and get a green light when it's actually plowing snow. So we've selected 5 corridors in Salt Lake Valley, which include Redwood Road, and that will have us installing 55 new intersections with DSRC equipment and 46 plows from 5 different maintenance sheds located around the valley that belong to the DOT. And the plan here is to improve safety by getting the roads cleared more quickly. That's sort of the goal here. The metric is a little harder to follow, a little harder to figure out, but that's the goal. And the plan is to have these 5 corridors outfitted before snow starts to fly this coming winter. So we're actively working on that now, and we have gone in and started to play with installing the equipment in the plows, and again, needing to find out when they're actually plowing. It turns out that finding out whether the blade is up or down was not a trivial thing, but it was fairly easy to find out whether the spreader on the back of the truck is turned on or turned off. And so we're actually monitoring the spreader. Our assumption, I think it's a valid assumption, is that if the spreader's on, the plow's probably down. They're actually probably plowing. And so that's what we're doing. So Johnny's got a little bit he wanted to talk about relative to this installation.
Oh. It's just interesting to note here that the snowplows are going to expand the usage of the DSRC on Redwood Road. And so we are going to, what we do is we filter by vehicle type. So the buses are going to be running down this corridor, and the plows are going to be running down this corridor. And so the roadside equipment distinguishes by vehicle type whether it's a plow or it's a bus, and different calls are made to the traffic signal based on the different vehicle types, and that can easily be extended to emergency vehicles. So it's just a nuance of and kind of expansion of the system to be able to support a variety of vehicle types.
So The vehicle has, the plow has equipment in it that operates the plow control systems, and it's manufactured by Force America. Johnny will talk a little bit about these systems, how we connected to them, and the antenna placement in these trucks.
So the controller units in the plows, again, the plows are quite advanced and complex in nature, and so we actually worked with Force America, and they were able to give us an output out of their controller that would throw 24 volts when the spreader went live, and we used that output from their controller to then tie to our Linux processor. So we built a custom board that would take an input from the plow controller and basically be used as an on-off switch to the system so that it could turn on priority or preemption and off again. And so that's really the approach that we did. We're talking to 3 different plow controller units, and we wanted to place the antenna on the roof of the truck, but we're discouraged by maintenance. The plows are in very rugged environments with the brine and the weather that they didn't want to do a roof penetration. And so for now we've done a dash mount, and we've been able to get the range necessary to run the programs and get the preemption spacing that we need to adequately notify the traffic signal. And that's really kind of the key. Again, it's important to work with the fleet owners, in this case it's UDOT, but the different plow foremen, so that they understand what's going on. And then our board also has the capability to be able to close a contact to turn on a dash light or something else if you want to provide driver feedback to let them know that the system's in operation. And then finally, on the plow installation, what we did is we fabricated a back plate with our onboard processor, the OBU, and any other contacts necessary. Like I mentioned, the Force America equipment outputs a 24-volt signal to us. We then run that through a dry contact relay and feed that into our onboard processor. And we did this kind of format for a couple of reasons, but the biggest one was we needed something that would be robust, could be installed in the truck in a flat form factor, and then something that could be installed quickly and easily. So we can just take this whole back panel, we mount it to the bulkhead behind the passenger seat, and then we just have to connect to the vehicle's power to the output of the Force America controller, and then place the antenna, and everything's self-contained and nice and neat and out of the way so that it won't be damaged and can be verified and tested as necessary.
So that's our summary of installing OBUs in these different kinds of vehicles. Hopefully there was something in there that was helpful. And I'll turn the time back over to Nilo.
Thanks, Blaine. So it's time for question and answer. I do see 1 or 2 questions coming, but please put in your questions, anything that you have for Blaine, Johnny, or Mark. Type them down in the question discussion pod here now. So the first question is for Blaine, and the question is, how do I understand that it's not using the CAN interface at all and just depending on the OBU GPS? And also the follow-up question is also, how were you able to modify the OBU temporary ID as part of the basic safety message?
So the first question, that's true. We're not using the CAN interface at all. We're depending on just the GPS in the OBU to get the data that we need on vehicle location and speed and all of that stuff. I'm going to let Johnny tackle the question about how we modified the temporary ID in the BSM.
So there's actually two approaches that we made. In the case of the CODA equipment, we generate the BSM and do everything in order to create that message, so we have the kind of capability to generate the vehicle ID on our onboard processor, and so that's what we do with that vendor. With the Lear equipment, we use the BSM generated there and the vehicle ID generated there, and they actually have a place in their firmware where you can go in and you can enter a custom vehicle ID just directly in their hardware itself.
Okay, any more questions? All right. So not seeing anyone typing any questions, I guess we don't have a lot of questions for this session today. I don't know if Blaine, Johnny, or Mark has anything to add, any closing thoughts or just comments for the participants before I close off the webinar.
No, I think we're good on the Utah end. If anybody has any questions about this that come up later, feel free to reach out, and we appreciate everybody being on the call today and participating.
Okay, great. So I really want to thank Blaine, Johnny, and Mark for helping us with this webinar today. Again, this was recorded and will be available soon on our website and will be sent to you as a follow-up email. On behalf of National Operations Center of Excellence and our presenters, thank you for joining us today and have a great rest of your day. Thank you.